Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Wherever you are, whatever the time, you're most welcome. This is the last video in the series that's designed to cover the first topic in Theme 1, which is economics as a social science. Today we're going to look at three issues. The first of these issues is, what do we mean by the phrase scientific method? The second topic that we'll examine is the inability in economics to carry out experiments in controlled laboratory conditions. And finally, we'll end today's session by explaining the use of the Ceteris Paribus assumption in economics. It's going to be fun. Enjoy! The scientific method begins with a hypothesis, which is a refutable idea. An example of a hypothesis might be paying workers a bonus will improve their motivation. The next step is to run an experiment. In this case, you could select two groups of workers. A bonus could be given to one group of workers, but not to the other. When the experiment has run its course, the results are then analysed. Did the workers in the group that got the bonus work harder than the workers in the control group who didn't get the bonus? If the facts fit the theory, in this case those that got the bonus worked harder, an economist might tentatively accept the hypothesis that bonuses do in fact improve motivation. On the other hand, if the results of the experiment fail to match the hypothesis will be rejected. At this point, the scientists will have to go back to the proverbial drawing board. They'll have to work on developing a new hypothesis, which then can be subsequently tested. In natural sciences, such as chemistry or physics, it's relatively easy to carry out experiments. This is because, in the natural sciences, experiments take place in controlled laboratory conditions. Let's take an example. The boiling point of water depends on two variables, which are atmospheric pressure and temperature. It's relatively easy for a chemist to discover the independent effect that temperature alone has on the boiling point of water, because a chemist can use their laboratory to run an experiment at a standard controlled pressure. In contrast, economists don't wear white coats. We don't devise our theories in controlled lab conditions. In economics and in other social sciences, it's usually impossible to set up experiments to test a hypothesis in environments which enable one factor to be changed whilst other factors are held constant. Unlike the chemist, the economist has to collect real-world data where many variables are changing at the same time. So the takeaway at this point is economists don't have access to laboratory conditions because we operate in a world where many factors are all changing at the same time. Therefore, it's very difficult to disentangle the independent effect that one variable has on another. Another difference between economics and the natural sciences pertains to what we study. Chemists study inanimate objects such as strips of magnesium. Inanimate objects react consistently. For example, if a chemist dips a strip of magnesium into water, it will react consistently and fizz every time. This consistency of reaction makes it fairly easy for a chemist to go about their business. Economists, in contrast, deal with people, unpredictable people. Unlike strips of magnesium, people aren't identical. We're all different. We're all unique indeed. The only example of us that will ever exist. It therefore makes sense to conclude that we don't all react to the same variable in the same way. For example, if the price of a Mars bar fell, I might choose to respond to this situation, to this price cut, by buying additional Mars bars. You, in contrast, might not choose to buy any more Mars bars when the price falls, because you've got different tastes and preferences to myself. To make things even more interesting for economists, people are also hard to predict. This is because we're unstable. Our tastes and preferences are constantly changing over time. For example, I might choose to buy a Mars bar today at a certain price. However, tomorrow I might reject the same offer because my tastes have changed. Maybe I've learned something that it's no good for me to eat too much sugary food. Magnesium strip, in contrast, doesn't learn. It's inert. It reacts in a very consistent way every single time. It's for that reason that I find economics far more interesting than chemistry. Precisely because in economics we're studying human beings rather than boring strips of magnesium. Apologies to any chemists who offended. Ceteris paribus is a Latin phrase meaning other things being equal. It's the most common assumption used in economics. In economics, it acts as a shorthand indication of the effect one economic variable has on another, provided all of the variables remain the same. Let's look at a situation where the Ceteris paribus assumption could be of some use to us. The demand for ginger beer is dependent on several variables, including consumer tastes and preferences, the price of ginger beer, the incomes of the buyers of ginger beer, the prices of other drinks such as Coca-Cola or lemonade that act as substitutes for ginger beer, advertising, the number of buyers, and finally the weather. Yes, this is also relevant to the sales of ginger beer because when it's hotter, people tend to drink more. This scatter graph provides some indication of how temperature affects the sales of ginger beer. Each blue blob shows what the temperature was and what the sales of ginger beer were day by day over a 12-day period. Each blue blob represents a particular day, what the temperature was and what the sales were. However, what we must recognise is that there are other factors that affect the sales of ginger beer other than temperature. As you know from GCSE maths, correlation doesn't always equal causation. Look at the last two dots on the graph. On day 11, the temperature was approximately 23.5 degrees Celsius and sales of ginger beer were approximately $540. On day 12, the temperature rose to 25.1 degrees Celsius and sales of ginger beer rose to $610. It would be tempting to claim that the increase in temperature was solely responsible for the $70 increase in sales. But this assumption or hypothesis or belief would be wrong. This is because some of the other factors other than temperature that affect the demand for ginger beer could have changed at the same time. For example, some of the increase in demand that we observed could have been due to a competitor raising their price. An economist would summarize this situation as follows. Assuming ceteris paribus, higher temperatures lead to higher sales of ginger beer. This graph is typical of the ones drawn by economists. It models how temperature affects sales of ginger beer, holding other things constant. The graph, by its very nature, cannot explicitly include all of the other relationships that are involved in determining the sales of ginger beer, such as consumer tastes, advertising, the price of substitute soft drinks, and so on. The diagram, in effect, is a simplified version of reality. Despite this, the simple economic model could still prove to be very useful for a soft drinks producer. Suppose that the weather forecast for the week ahead predicts a temperature of X. Using this information, we could predict that, Ceteris Paribus, sales next week will be Y. When one of the other variables that affect the demand for ginger beer change, the position of the line will shift. For example, if the buyers of ginger beer experience an increase in their incomes, one would expect sales of ginger beer to rise, regardless of temperature. This will cause the curve to shift to the left. At a temperature of X, one would now expect sales of ginger beer to be Z, not Y. So, in conclusion, an economic model cannot be faulted merely because it does not represent every detail of the real world. That same model may be very realistic in terms of explaining the central issue at hand, which in this case is the effect of temperature on sales of ginger beer. Every theory, then, is an abstraction of reality, a simplified version of it. And this is the business of economics. So that brings us to the end of this presentation, and indeed the end of this first section of the economics course. And, in the words of Bugs Bunny, that's all, folks.